I'm a practicing civil engineer with Kimley, so a local firm to Minnesota. And I've been practicing for about 20 years, and particularly on the data center front, I did my first data center project in 2012. So in the spectrum of the industry, it's a fairly long time, 14 years now, and I've had the pleasure of working on small projects, big projects, edge, co-location data centers. We'll go over what all these are in a minute, all the way to hyperscale and working directly for the end users versus the developer. So a very broad spectrum of experience that I can draw on. So I'm going to dive in, and I have a lot of information. I could probably talk for hours on this, so I'm going to try to go through the slides relatively fast. Again, we've got time for Q&A. Data centers are not a simple topic, right? So I'm going to try to give you as much information as I can in a digestible manner. So let's start about what they are. Do you use your smartphone? Do you use your computer? Any connectivity to your car? Almost everything we do in our waking hour is going through a data center. It's really quite alarming. So these are very basic things that we would do in our day-to-day, as far as Googling information online, using email, accessing your banks online. So those are relatively basic. But then societally wise, things like national security. I was even surprised several years ago to learn my mom had open heart surgery and some follow-up surgeries. Those are robotic, right? Those are going through a data center. So we want to make sure that that information, that connectivity is not lost. EMS 9/11 response, and then machine learning for medical breakthroughs. I've got some examples if we want to talk more on that. But to summarize it, they are really the nodes of our modern day digital highway, the backbone of almost everything we do on a daily basis, and really pivotal to have a good network of data centers in our country. There is also a lot of false information out in the world, or outdated. The data centers we're building today are very different than what was built 20 years ago, what was built 10, even 5 years ago, even a few years ago. So there's a lot of either wrong or outdated information out there. So hopefully today we can get you some, correct information from, again, seeing these over the last 14 years or so. A little more technically, as far as what a data center is, it houses servers and chips, right? It's rows and rows of essentially like computer servers. They do require redundant backup power supplies, communication connections. They're highly secure, and they're 24/7 facilities. Data doesn't stop. And even more simply put, they're the cloud. Oh, it's on the cloud somewhere. No, it's in the data center. Okay, so now to get a layer deeper, what different types of data centers. So co-location is where a company may lease part of or a row of servers within a broader hosted data center. There's a lot of these in Minnesota. There has been for 2 or 3 decades. And they're in Minneapolis, they're in the suburbs, they're all across the state. Enterprise would be for, if a bank builds their own data centers for a company. Hyperscale is a lot of what we'll talk about today, and by the name, big scale. There's not a specific cutoff, but generally I would say more than 100 megawatts would be a hyperscale. Often it's a campus, multiple buildings. An edge data center is smaller, it's closer to population densities. It's for the low latency of needing to pull information really quick. So for a lot of companies, there's a lot of these in downtown Minneapolis, around any city center. And then there's a lot of other, just I'll say, underground experimental data centers, evolving very quickly. So how else can we apply these? Where can we put them? What works, what doesn't, etc. So again, the hyperscale that's got the asterisks, that's where we're going to spend most of our time, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on. So as far as what they really need, I like to look at it in kind of 5 areas. And that's power, number 1, fiber, number 2, water, I would classify as sometimes, and we'll talk more on that. They also need a good jurisdictional partner. and then a workable site and trade area. Kind of self-explanatory, but the site has to lend itself and it has to make sense to put it there. And then there has to be enough local support, not only for construction jobs, but for operational jobs as well. We are not going to have time today to talk about kind of all these related or like common impacts and questions, which are the boxes kind of surrounding this graphic. I'm going to try to hit on a few of them. But these are, what we most often hear or responding to help educate about data centers. So first for power, yes, this is increasing significantly. Just a few stats and numbers. 2023 data centers accounted for about 4.5% of the total electricity used in the US. That is going to double or triple by 2028. There's a lot going on here, but to focus your attention on the pie chart, the darker red is data centers. And you can see that overall, this is electricity growth. While they are getting a lot of attention and they are growing and they are needing more electricity, it still is a relatively small piece of the pie in terms of the other industries and other demands for electricity. Sticking on power, from how much power does a data center need? Well, that's a very open-ended answer. I'll classify it to 10 megawatts on the low side for like an edge data center, all the way up to 1,000 or multiples of thousands for a large hyperscale campus. From a power standpoint, they are often and now legislatively driven in Minnesota to be a separate rate classification to ensure to the ratepayers that they are not going to negatively impact their rates. So kept in their own bucket per se. In my experience with all the projects, they've always paid their own way with grid improvements. As most of you know, our grid is fairly antiquated since its initial build out. 60-ish years ago, right? Like there's a lot of improvements that need to be made, and this is a investment in kind of an infusion of money that is able to help make some of them, not all of them, but it's able to actually help strengthen the grid in a lot of ways. So that's how I kind of position it from grid strain is how people think about it, but really there's a lot of grid strength and advantages to having them help with some of the improvements. There's other grid stability in the blue box on the bottom. Things like demand response, on-site energy storage that was mentioned earlier about like the best battery energy storage systems, and on-site generation is being explored more and more and more because there is a demand for electrons that aren't there right now. So this is being explored much more often now. I also do want to note that from a kind of broad spectrum from renewable advancements, the tech companies that are behind most of these data centers, they are really the key catalyst of the renewable energy growth. So a lot of the wind and the solar and the BESS that has come online and is going to be coming online is somehow tied to them, right? And so the investment is actually really helping advance that renewable energy and away from coal sources. Okay, I'm gonna shift to water. So not all data centers need water for cooling. That is one very huge misconception out there that, oh my God, they need a ton of water, they're gonna take out water. And in fact, that is becoming even further from the truth as technology advances in the cooling system. The closed loop cooling system was mentioned earlier. That is very correct. That is much more prevalent these days, probably the most prevalent type of cooling system. And this could be a whole couple of day session in itself. So I'm going to try to boil this down and walk you through this graphic a little bit. But on the left of kind of that sliding scale on the top, you've got like an air-cooled air conditioning unit. So think, giant air conditioning units for a very big building that these servers get quite hot, right? So it's got to pump out a lot of cool air and suck out the warm air. And then you move one slot over to a closed loop with dry coolers or air-cooled chillers. a little bit more efficient, quite a bit more efficient, actually, I should say. And both of these two, you will still need some water to the data center, but that's domestic potable water, right? For your toilets, your sinks, stuff like that. So that is a relatively very low demand. And I have some comparisons here in a second. And then moving over to the kind of third category, the direct evaporative cooling is sort of a hybrid system if you want to think about it that way. So it uses more water than a closed loop system, but less than the full like water cooled chillers. And the water cooled chillers are, if you think about like cooling towers that, you see water streaming down, those do take the most water. That's what I think comes into people's head when they think data centers, but in my experience, and maybe nowadays, there might be, the spitball is 1 out of every 30 data centers is even considering that, right? And that's in some more unique conditions where you've got a freshwater, surface water source where you might be able to use it and return it. So these are becoming more and more obsolete in the industry. The arrow below it is indicating power. So if you did use a lot of water, you would use less power for cooling. Using no water, you use more power. So from an engineering standpoint, where it ends up always being the $1 million question is, where do you strike that balance? And that's based on the locality, based on, what you're surrounded by, a lot of factors that go into that, your temperature, weather patterns, wind, so it's a complicated, it's not a simple answer to say, well, we're going to be, but all of the data center end users and all of us engineers that are working for them, we are always trying to optimize this and make this as efficient as possible. So that's, I think that's the most on that slide. So to have some comparative numbers on periods, now this is taken like per 100 megawatt block. A closed loop system is roughly equivalent to what 10 houses use. Okay, so it's not a lot at all. Again, that's more, that's domestic. The closed loop system, after the initial fill, hardly any water is used. So that's vast majority just your toilets, your sinks, etc. Direct evaporative cooling, again, same 100 megawatt block, would use roughly equivalent to 3.5 car wash facilities. From a water sustainability standpoint, I put some examples from a lot of, or some of the, 4 main end users that everybody's gonna, has heard of or knows. And they've got really aggressive goals to be water positive, to replenish more water than they use. So they're putting a lot of focus in trying to, kind of strengthen the water picture, knowing that it is a valuable resource. So they take that very seriously too. They're not trying to just use as much water as they possibly can. An example, we're as engineers too, we're always looking at how can we reuse water. Water used from wastewater treatment plants, as mentioned earlier, that is something that we look at very often. We're always looking at how can we have this water circularity going on. This is one example from, and this is a fairly simple representation of, if it was a direct evaporative cooling, some of the water is going to be absorbed in that process, but what isn't absorbed, roughly a third of it, can be infiltrated back into the ground. I'm going to move on a little bit and kind of wrap up or go up a level into just environmental precautions and permitting overall. These projects are big. They are giant investments, often in the billions of dollars. There's a lot of diligence that is done. There are also a lot of coordination that we have with different state and federal agencies. So this is, and I know you're not going to be able to read all this. This is more, and I'll explain what I'm trying to get at here, but that there, for every aspect you can think about from a data center development, I guarantee you, especially in Minnesota, there is an agency or a department, permitting authority, et cetera, that has jurisdiction over that, right? That the project is going to be coordinating with and working with. The bottom ribbon is an example, and this is up in the metro area, but an example of a data center project and the different components and the different both federal, local, state agencies, departments, authorities that we would be working with, right? So on this example, there's 30-ish different departments and agencies that we would work through and coordinate with in the process of a project. So there are a lot of checks and balances, a lot of regulatory oversight for anything like this. So to kind of wrap it up, then, you know, there is a lot of really strong benefits that data centers do bring to a community. I'll dial through these quick. There's one slide for each of them. But economic development, I want to put an asterisk with a low burden on services. So they will bring a strong tax base, but they don't bring a ton of traffic. They don't have a lot of 911 and fire calls that they need to respond to. They will bring some kids to the local schools, but they're not going to bring thousands like a manufacturing plant would that would require new schools to be built, stuff like that. So they actually have a very low burden when they're operational, but yet have a very high tax benefit. There's some Loudoun County information that they found they were 26-1 as far as they pay $26 in taxes for every $1 in local public services that they use. Jobs. This one also is a lot of different information across the board. There is no doubt a ton of construction jobs, a lot of construction jobs, and those can be anywhere from 2 to 10 years for a build out. So they're like long-term construction jobs. They do have a moderate to lower, is how I would classify it, operating jobs. But they're good, high-paying jobs. And with that, this kind of jumps into the second bullet of there's actually a really strong multiplier. So while there might be a low to moderate amount of jobs at the data center when it's operating, there's found to be in a lot of studies a 6-to-1 multiplier, that there's for every one direct data center job, there's 6-ish that are created or induced from it. Really strong community partnerships, and I can really vouch for this from working on a lot of projects and seeing how they come in and how they want to partner with the community, help, whether it's a local schools or stream cleanups or where like they know that they have the ability to make a positive impact, so they're looking at how can they do that. And then we talked a little bit about the infrastructure from a power standpoint, but even infrastructure from a water and sewer standpoint. If they're build outs to the site, again, they're almost always driven, or they're almost always paid for by the developer, by the end user, and that has a lot of benefits for other members of the community as well, and even opening areas up for future development, other development. So that is what I have. So that's a lot of information. Thanks for sticking with me.